Millionaire abandons pregnant girlfriend years later. She appears with a life-changing secret. The sound of crystal glasses clinking filled the opulent hall, a cacophony of laughter and soft jazz mingling in the air. Ethan Warren adjusted the cufflinks on his custom-tailored suit as he surveyed the scene. The ballroom was a testament to his success, a glittering masterpiece of marble floors, towering floral arrangements, and guests draped in designer finery. Yet, amidst the glamour, Ethan's eyes betrayed a weariness he couldn't quite shake. He swirled the champagne in his glass absent-mindedly, the golden liquid catching the light. Another charity gala, another round of networking, another performance. To anyone watching, he was the epitome of confidence and charm, a self-made millionaire who had climbed the ranks with ruthless determination. But to Ethan, these events had long since lost their allure. "Ethan," a voice called out, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned to see Julian, his business partner, approaching with an enthusiastic smile. "You've got to meet the new donors from Silver Crest Investments. They're dying to talk to you." Ethan plastered on a practiced smile and followed Julian toward a small group of impeccably dressed individuals. The introductions began, names and titles exchanged with polite handshakes, but Ethan's focus was slipping. His mind wandered as the conversations blurred together, the monotony of it all pressing down on him. That was when he saw her, standing near the edge of the ballroom, partially obscured by a group of chatting guests, was a woman who seemed out of place among the glittering crowd. Her simple black dress was elegant yet understated, and her poise held an air of quiet confidence. Something about her felt hauntingly familiar, though Ethan couldn't immediately place it. Her eyes caught his for a fleeting moment before she turned away, but that brief connection was enough to send a chill down his spine. Ethan excused himself from the group, his curiosity piqued, and began weaving through the crowd toward her. She stood near a table laden with hors d'oeuvres, her fingers idly tracing the edge of a wine glass. "Excuse me," Ethan said as he approached, his voice tinged with curiosity. "I couldn't help but notice you from across the room. Have we met before?" The woman turned to face him fully, and Ethan's breath caught. It had been years, but there was no mistaking those eyes. "Claire, I suppose you could say that," she replied, her tone measured. There was no warmth in her expression, only a cool detachment that made Ethan feel uncharacteristically uneasy. "Claire," he breathed, barely able to believe what he was seeing. Memories flooded back. Memories he had tried to bury for years. "It's been a long time." "It has," she said simply, her gaze unwavering. "Though not long enough to forget." Ethan winced at the sharpness in her tone. He opened his mouth to speak, to say something, anything, that might bridge the chasm between them, but Claire cut him off. "I didn't come here for pleasantries, Ethan," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that hinted at deeper emotions simmering beneath the surface. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a folded piece of paper, which she handed to him without another word. Ethan took it hesitantly, unfolding it to reveal a photograph. His chest tightened as he stared at the image. A young boy, no older than 10, with dark hair and piercing eyes that bore an uncanny resemblance to his own. He looked up at Claire, his mind racing. "Who?" "This is your son," Claire said, her words landing like a thunderclap. "The son you walked away from." The world seemed to tilt beneath Ethan's feet. His carefully constructed facade of control and composure began to crumble as the weight of her words sank in. He stared at the photograph again, as if willing it to be anything other than what it was, but the truth was undeniable. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't care to know," Claire shot back, her eyes narrowing. "You made your choice, Ethan. You left me when I needed you most, and you never looked back." Her words were like daggers, each one slicing through the veneer of his success to expose the hollowness underneath. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. What could he possibly say to justify his actions? Claire took a step closer, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. "Do you know what it's like to raise a child on your own?" To work 2 jobs just to keep a roof over your head while watching other kids grow up with the things you can't afford to give your own? Do you have any idea how many nights I stayed up, wondering how I was going to make it through another day? Ethan's heart pounded as he listened, guilt and regret swirling in his chest. He had spent years chasing wealth and success, convincing himself that the past was behind him. But now, faced with the living consequence of his choices, he couldn't escape the truth. He began, but Claire shook her head. "Save it," she said. "I didn't come here for apologies. I came here because our son deserves better than the silence you've given him all these years. He's an incredible boy, Ethan, and he deserves to know where he comes from. Whether you step up now is entirely up to you." With that, Claire turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing in stunned silence. The photograph trembled in his hand as he stared after her, the echoes of her words ringing in his ears. For the first time in years, Ethan Warren felt truly powerless. Ethan sat in his study later that night, the photograph Claire had handed him resting on the desk before him. The boy's face stared back at him, a stark reminder of the life he had left behind. His hands, usually steady as they signed million-dollar deals or raised glasses at galas, now trembled as he reached for his glass of scotch. The room, filled with shelves of leather-bound books and art pieces worth small fortunes, felt suffocating. The wealth he had amassed over the years had always been his shield, a way to prove, to himself and the world, that he was in control. But now, all the money and power in the world couldn't buy him an escape from the weight of Claire's words. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as memories began to surface. He hadn't thought about Claire in years, but now her face was all he could see. The way she had smiled at him in those early days, when their love felt like the only thing that mattered. The way her laughter had filled the small apartment they had shared before his career had taken off. And the way her voice had broken when he had told her he couldn't stay. "It's not the right time," he had said, standing in the doorway with his suitcase in hand. "I can't give you the life you deserve. And you think leaving will?" Claire had asked, tears streaming down her face. "Ethan, this isn't about what I deserve. It's about us, about our family." But he hadn't listened. Fear of failure, of losing his chance at success, had driven him to walk away. He had told himself it was for the best, that Claire would be better off without him holding her back. But now, years later, he couldn't ignore the truth. He hadn't left for Claire. He had left for himself. Ethan opened his eyes and reached for the photograph again. The boy, his son, looked so much like him it was almost unnerving. How could he have spent all these years unaware of his existence? What kind of man did that make him? The knock at the door startled him. He straightened in his chair as Julian, his business partner, poked his head into the room. "Hey, you okay?" Julian asked, stepping inside. "You disappeared from the gala earlier. People were asking about you." "I needed some air," Ethan replied, his voice clipped. He wasn't in the mood for company, but Julian closed the door and took a seat across from him anyway. "You've been off lately," Julian said, leaning back in the chair. "Something going on?" Ethan hesitated. Julian had been his confidant for years, the one person who had stood by him through every triumph and setback. But this was different. This wasn't about business or reputation. This was personal. "It's nothing," Ethan said finally, sliding the photograph into a drawer. Julian raised an eyebrow but didn't press. "Well, whatever it is, don't let it distract you. We've got that meeting with the investors next week, and we can't afford to have you out of your game." Ethan nodded absently, his thoughts still on Claire and the boy. He watched as Julian left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt truly untethered, as though everything he had built was slipping through his fingers. The next morning, Ethan found himself standing in front of the window of his penthouse apartment, staring out at the city skyline. The bustling streets below were a reminder of the life he had chosen. A life of ambition and wealth, of constant motion and relentless pursuit. But now the view felt hollow. His phone buzzed on the counter, jolting him from his thoughts. He picked it up, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the message. "Meet me at the park." 3 p.m. Don't be late, Claire. Ethan's fingers hovered over the screen, uncertainty swirling in his chest. Part of him wanted to ignore the message, to push Claire and the past back into the shadows where they had been buried for so long. But another part of him, the part that had spent the night staring at that photograph, knew he couldn't. At exactly 3 p.m., Ethan arrived at the park. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and the sound of children's laughter echoed from the nearby playground. He scanned the area, his eyes landing on Claire sitting on a bench beneath a towering oak tree. She wasn't alone. The boy sat beside her, his legs swinging idly as he talked. Claire listened with a small smile, her attention fully on him. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched them, the reality of what he had missed sinking in deeper. He took a breath and walked toward them, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Claire looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. "You came," she said, her voice even. "I didn't think I had much of a choice," Ethan replied, his gaze shifting to the boy. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. Claire glanced at the boy. "This is Luke. Luke, this is Ethan." Luke looked up at Ethan, his dark eyes curious but guarded. "Hi," he said simply, his voice soft. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. "Hi, Luke," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Finally, Claire spoke. "I thought it was time you two met," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "Luke's old enough to ask questions, and I wasn't going to lie to him about who his father is." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. He wanted to say something, to explain, but where could he even begin? The life he had lived, the choices he had made, they all felt like insurmountable walls between him and the boy sitting before him. "I'd like to get to know you," Ethan said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "If you'll let me." Claire studied him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "That's up to Luke." Ethan looked at his son, his heart pounding. "What do you say, Luke?" The boy hesitated, his small fingers fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. Finally, he looked up at Ethan, his gaze steady. "Maybe, but you'll have to try really hard." Ethan couldn't help but smile, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. "I will. Promise." Ethan felt the weight of those words, "You'll have to try really hard," settle into his chest as he walked away from the park. Luke's guarded expression lingered in his mind, a stark reminder that rebuilding what had been broken wouldn't be easy. For years, Ethan had avoided confronting his past, and now it had come crashing into his carefully curated life with a force he wasn't prepared for. Back in his penthouse, Ethan sat in silence, staring out at the city as the sun dipped below the horizon. His thoughts churned relentlessly. How could he make up for years of absence? How could he explain the choices he'd made not just to Luke but to himself? He realized with a pang of regret that he didn't even know where to start. The following days were a blur of meetings and obligations, but Ethan's focus wavered. Even during high-stakes negotiations, his mind wandered to Claire and Luke. He thought about Claire's strength, the quiet resolve in her voice as she spoke about raising Luke on her own. It humbled him in a way nothing else ever had. Determined not to let the opportunity slip away, Ethan reached out to Claire a week later. This time, he didn't ask her to meet in some neutral, public place. He invited her and Luke to his home. "Are you sure about this?" Claire asked over the phone, her tone skeptical. "I am," Ethan replied. "I want him to know my world, Claire. I want to be honest with him about who I am and where I've been." There was a pause on the line, and Ethan could almost hear her weighing the decision. "All right," she said finally. "But don't expect miracles, Ethan. He's cautious for a reason." When the doorbell rang that Saturday afternoon, Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He opened the door to find Claire standing there with Luke, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Luke looked around the lavish foyer, his wide eyes taking in the soaring ceilings and gleaming marble floors. "You live here?" Luke asked, his voice tinged with awe. Ethan smiled faintly. "I do, but it's just a house, Luke. What matters is who's in it." Claire gave Ethan a pointed look, as if to say prove it, before stepping inside. Ethan led them to the living room, where a fire crackled in the hearth and an array of snacks was laid out on the coffee table. He had agonized over what Luke might like, eventually opting for a mix of finger foods and kid-friendly treats. They sat together, the atmosphere tense but civil. Ethan struggled to find the right words, but Claire, ever the steady presence, eased the conversation along. "Luke, why don't you tell Ethan about your science project?" she suggested, nudging him gently. Luke hesitated, then pulled a small notebook out of his backpack. He flipped through the pages, showing Ethan a series of sketches and diagrams. "It's about renewable energy," he explained. "I'm building a model wind turbine." Ethan leaned forward, genuinely impressed. "That's incredible. Did you come up with all of this on your own?" Luke nodded, his confidence growing under Ethan's attention. "Yeah. Mom helped me a little with the research, but I designed it myself." "Smart kid," Ethan said, glancing at Claire. "Takes after his mom." Claire smiled faintly but didn't respond, letting the moment settle. For the first time, Ethan felt a glimmer of connection with Luke, a fragile thread he was determined to nurture. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation flowed more easily. Ethan found himself laughing at Luke's quick wit and marveling at his curiosity. Claire, too, seemed to relax, though she remained cautious. By the time they left, Ethan felt a tentative sense of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He replayed the day in his mind, dissecting every interaction and wondering if he had done enough to earn even a sliver of trust. The photograph of Luke, now framed, sat on his bedside table. It was a constant reminder of the time he couldn't get back, but also of the time he still had. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He wouldn't let his guilt paralyze him. If Luke needed him to try harder, then that's exactly what he would do. Over the next few weeks, Ethan made a concerted effort to be present in Luke's life. He attended Luke's science fair, where the boys' wind turbine earned first place. He took him to museums, introducing him to exhibits that aligned with his budding interest in engineering. Slowly but surely, Luke began to open up, his initial wariness giving way to cautious curiosity. Claire, ever watchful, remained a steady presence. She didn't make things easy for Ethan. She didn't trust him fully yet, but she allowed him the space to prove himself. And Ethan, for the first time in years, found himself caring about something beyond his business empire. One evening, as they sat together in a cafe after an outing, Luke turned to Ethan with a question that caught him off guard. "Why did you leave us?" he asked, his voice quiet but direct. Ethan froze, his chest tightening. He had known this question would come eventually, but that didn't make it any easier. "I was scared," Ethan admitted after a long pause. "I didn't think I was ready to be a father. I told myself it was better to leave than to mess things up." Luke frowned, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. "That's a dumb reason." Ethan couldn't help but chuckle softly, though his heart ached. "You're right. It was a dumb reason. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. And I'm sorry, Luke. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you and your mom." Luke studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he shrugged. "At least you're here now." The simplicity of his words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He didn't deserve Luke's forgiveness, but he would do everything in his power to earn it. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, the threads of a relationship began to form between Ethan and Luke. It was an uneven process. Luke still approached their time together with caution, and Claire never let her guard down completely. But Ethan was learning day by day how to be present, how to listen, and how to rebuild trust. Ethan began carving out regular time in his packed schedule to see Luke. Every Saturday, they would meet for a new activity, visiting a science exhibit, working on small engineering projects together, or simply spending time at the park. Ethan marveled at Luke's sharp mind and boundless curiosity. He was meticulous and inventive, traits that reminded Ethan of his younger self before ambition had consumed him. One Saturday afternoon, they sat at Ethan's sprawling dining table, surrounded by tools and supplies for a new project, building a model rocket. Luke's face lit up as he explained the design he had in mind, scribbling equations on a scrap of paper. And if we adjust the angle here, Luke said, pointing at a sketch of the rocket's fins, it'll go higher. Ethan leaned over, impressed by his son's focus. You're way ahead of where I was at your age, he said. I think you might be an engineer someday. Luke grinned, the walls between them momentarily forgotten. Maybe. Or an astronaut. Ethan chuckled, his heart swelling. These moments, small, unassuming, meant more to him than he had ever imagined. But as he watched Luke tinker with the rocket, a pang of regret tugged at him. He couldn't shake the thought of everything he had missed. The first steps, the first words, the birthdays and milestones that had passed without him. Luke, Ethan said after a moment, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Can I ask you something? Luke glanced up from his sketchpad. Sure. What was it like, growing up? Without me, I mean. The boy hesitated, his brow furrowing. It was okay, I guess. Mom worked a lot, so it was just me and her most of the time. Sometimes it was hard, but she always made sure I had what I needed. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. Your mom is an incredible woman, he said. I don't think I've ever told her that enough. Luke shrugged, returning to his sketch. Yeah, she's pretty awesome. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that Ethan couldn't ignore. Claire had done what he hadn't. She had stayed. She had fought for their son, even when the odds were against her. Ethan vowed, silently and fiercely, to honor that strength by being the father Luke deserved. One evening, Ethan invited Claire over for dinner. It was the first time she had stepped foot in his penthouse since their reunion, and the atmosphere was tense. Claire walked through the grand entrance with her usual poise, her gaze sweeping over the opulent decor with a hint of disdain. Still the same Ethan, she remarked dryly as she set her purse down. Always the best of everything. Ethan winced, but he couldn't argue. I wanted tonight to be special, he said, gesturing toward the dining room, where the table was set with fine china and candles. For Luke, for us. Claire's expression softened slightly, but she remained wary. Let's see how it goes. The dinner began awkwardly, with Ethan fumbling through polite conversation and Luke alternating between excitement and shyness. But as the evening wore on, the tension began to ease. Luke animatedly described a book he was reading, and even Claire couldn't help but smile as he launched into a detailed retelling of a daring adventure. You've been reading a lot more lately, Claire said, her tone warm. I think spending time with Ethan has been good for you. Luke shrugged, though a small smile tugged at his lips. He's not so bad. Ethan chuckled, raising his glass in a mock toast. High praise from my toughest critic. Claire smirked, but her eyes held a flicker of something deeper. Perhaps hope, or at least the beginning of it. As the weeks passed, Ethan and Claire began to spend more time together, not just as co-parents but as two people navigating a shared history. Their conversations were cautious at first, circling around the pain of the past without confronting it directly. But one evening, as they sat together at a small cafe after dropping Luke off at a friend's house, Claire broke the silence. Why now, Ethan? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. Why are you trying so hard after all these years? Ethan stared into his coffee, his chest tightening. He had asked himself the same question countless times. Because I was wrong, he said finally, his voice raw. I thought I was doing the right thing by walking away, but all I did was run from my responsibilities. And now, I see what I missed, what I threw away. I can't change the past, but I want to do better. For Luke, for you. Claire studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Do you really think you can fix this? That you can make up for everything? Ethan shook his head. I don't know, but I'm willing to try no matter how long it takes. Claire sighed, her gaze softening. You heard us, Ethan. Me and Luke. But he's starting to trust you, and I won't stand in the way of that. Just don't make promises you can't keep. I won't, Ethan said, his voice steady. I'm here to stay. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was part of something real, something that mattered. The walls he had built around himself were crumbling, replaced by connections that went beyond business deals and social status. Luke's laughter, Claire's strength, the warmth of a shared meal. These were the things that filled the emptiness he had carried for so long. But even as hope blossomed, Ethan knew there were still battles to fight. Trust wasn't something that could be earned overnight, and the scars of the past wouldn't fade easily. But for the first time, Ethan believed he had something worth fighting for. The seasons shifted, and with them, so did the rhythms of their fragile new normal. Ethan had settled into his role in Luke's life, finding himself eagerly anticipating the Saturdays they spent together. These moments were unlike anything he had ever experienced. For someone who had spent his life mastering boardrooms and social galas, the simplicity of teaching Luke how to perfect his spiral throw or helping him with a particularly tricky math problem felt monumental. But Claire remained cautious. While she appreciated Ethan's growing bond with Luke, she couldn't shake the lingering shadow of doubt. Ethan had abandoned them once, and the scars of that decision ran deep. One crisp autumn afternoon, Claire invited Ethan to attend Luke's school play. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. An unspoken acknowledgement that she was slowly letting him in. Ethan arrived early, the auditorium already buzzing with parents chatting excitedly and taking seats. He spotted Claire in the middle row, saving a spot for him. "Hey," Ethan said softly as he slid into the seat beside her. Claire gave him a small nod. "He's nervous. He's been practicing his lines nonstop for weeks." "I'm sure he'll be great," Ethan replied, his voice tinged with pride. The lights dimmed, and the play began. Luke appeared in the second act, his voice steady as he delivered his lines with surprising confidence. Ethan felt a swell of emotion as he watched his son on stage. For the first time, he wasn't just seeing Luke as a child. He was seeing him as someone with dreams, talent, and a future full of possibility. When the play ended, they waited in the crowded hallway for Luke to emerge from backstage. The boy beamed when he saw them, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "You were incredible," Ethan said, crouching to Luke's level. "I'm so proud of you." "Thanks," Luke replied, his grin widening. "Did you see the part where I—" "Every second," Ethan interrupted. "You owned that stage." Claire watched the interaction quietly, her heart caught between hope and hesitation. As much as she wanted to believe in Ethan's transformation, a part of her remained guarded. Trust, after all, wasn't rebuilt in a single season. One evening, several weeks later, Ethan called Claire. She answered on the third ring, her voice soft but wary. "Hey," she said. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Ethan replied. I've been thinking about everything, about Luke, and you." Claire didn't respond immediately, and Ethan took a breath before continuing. "I want to do something for him," he said. "Something meaningful. I know I can't erase the past, but maybe I can give him a future." "What do you mean?" Claire asked, her tone cautious. "I've been working on setting up a trust for him," Ethan explained. "It's not just about money. It's about creating opportunities. For his education, for anything he wants to do in life." Claire was silent for a moment. "That's generous," she said finally. "But, Ethan, you can't just throw money at this and expect it to fix everything." "I know," Ethan said quickly. "This isn't about fixing things. It's about giving him options. I want him to know he can chase any dream he has, and I'll be there to support him." Claire sighed. "He'll appreciate that. But what he needs more than anything is you. Present. Consistent. Don't lose sight of that." "I won't," Ethan promised. "I'm not going anywhere." Ethan's gesture, while well-intentioned, sparked a deeper conversation between him and Claire. They met for coffee a few days later, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. "You've changed," Claire said, her hands wrapped around her mug. "I'll give you that. But I need to understand something, Ethan." "Why now? Why are you doing all of this after so many years?" Ethan stared at the steam rising from his coffee, searching for the right words. "Because I see now what I missed, what I turned my back on. And it haunts me, Claire. Every day." Her eyes softened slightly, but she didn't let him off the hook. "It's not just about regret, Ethan. You need to think about what Luke needs. He's a kid, he's learning how to trust you, but he's also watching every move you make. Don't disappoint him." "I won't," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I'm here for the long haul, whatever it takes." Luke's trust in Ethan continued to grow, but not without its challenges. One afternoon, while they were working on a school project together, Ethan's phone buzzed incessantly with work calls. Luke's expression darkened as Ethan kept glancing at the screen, eventually excusing himself to take a call. When Ethan returned, Luke's arms were crossed, his jaw set. "Do you always have to work?" the boy asked, his tone sharp. Ethan froze, guilt washing over him. "I'm sorry, Luke. I didn't mean to make you feel like I wasn't paying attention." Luke shrugged, looking down at the table. "Mom never does that." The words stung, but Ethan took them to heart. From that day forward, he made a conscious effort to leave work behind during their time together. It wasn't always easy, but he knew it was necessary. As the months passed, Ethan began to feel a deeper sense of purpose. His bond with Luke was growing stronger, and even Claire seemed to be letting her guard down, bit by bit. But the journey was far from over. One evening, Ethan invited Claire and Luke over for dinner. After the meal, Luke excused himself to play in the living room, leaving Ethan and Claire alone at the table. "Thank you," Claire said suddenly, her voice soft, "for everything you've done for Luke. This made a difference." Ethan looked at her, his heart aching with the weight of everything left unsaid. "I should be thanking you," he said. "You've done everything for him, Claire. You've been his rock. I don't deserve a second chance, but I'm grateful you're giving me one." Claire's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Don't waste it, Ethan. He's a special kid, and he deserves the world." "I know," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion, "and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure he gets it." The air was crisp and cool as winter descended, blanketing the city in a soft glow of holiday lights. Ethan stood outside the small theater where Luke's school was hosting its annual holiday recital. Parents milled about, their laughter and chatter blending with the faint sound of music drifting from inside. He spotted Claire approaching with Luke. The boy was bundled up in a coat too big for his small frame, but his face lit up with excitement as he waved at Ethan. "You made it," Luke said, bounding up to him. "Of course," Ethan replied, crouching to Luke's level. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Luke grinned, and Ethan felt a surge of warmth. It wasn't the extravagant displays of wealth or power he had once craved that gave him satisfaction now. It was these moments, the simple, unfiltered joy of being part of his son's life. Inside, the recital was a lively affair. Children sang and danced, their youthful energy filling the room. Ethan and Claire sat side by side, their shared pride palpable as they watched Luke perform. For the first time, the space between them didn't feel like a chasm. After the recital, they went to a nearby diner, a modest spot Luke had chosen for its milkshakes. The three of them squeezed into a booth, the warmth of the diner a welcome reprieve from the cold outside. "You were amazing out there," Ethan said, raising his milkshake in a mock toast to Luke. Luke laughed, his cheeks flushed with pride. "Thanks. Did you see my solo?" "I did. You nailed it." Claire smiled, watching the easy banter between them. It was moments like these that gave her hope. Maybe, just maybe, Ethan was becoming the man Luke needed him to be. The holidays passed, and the new year brought new beginnings. Ethan had made good on his promise to prioritize Luke, setting firm boundaries with his work and carving out time to be present. Claire remained cautiously optimistic, but she couldn't deny the changes she saw in him. One afternoon, as they sat in a park watching Luke play soccer with friends, Ethan turned to Claire. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began. "About not just throwing money at things." Claire glanced at him, curious. "And I've started volunteering at the Boys and Girls Club," he said. "I want to give back in a way that feels real. It's not just about Luke. It's about making up for all the times I prioritized the wrong things." Claire's expression softened. "That's surprising, but good. It's good." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on Luke. "I want him to see that people can change, that it's never too late to do the right thing." Claire was quiet for a moment. "You've come a long way, Ethan. I didn't think you had it in you." "Neither did I," he admitted with a small smile. "But Luke changed that. He gave me something to fight for." As winter gave way to spring, The rhythm of their lives began to settle into something resembling normalcy. Ethan's relationship with Luke continued to flourish, and even Claire began to trust him in ways she hadn't before. One evening, after a long day, Ethan found himself standing outside Claire's modest home. He had dropped Luke off after an afternoon together and lingered, the weight of something unsaid pressing on him. "Do you want to come in?" Claire asked, leaning against the doorframe. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." Inside, the house was warm and inviting, the kind of place that felt like home. They sat in the living room, a small lamp casting a soft glow over the space. "You've done an incredible job raising him," Ethan said after a while. "He's smart, kind, and resilient. That's all because of you." Claire looked at him, her eyes searching. "You're part of his life now, Ethan. That matters too." He nodded, the sincerity in her voice grounding him. "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to be here. For him, for you, for whatever comes next." Claire's lips curved into a faint smile. "We'll see. One step at a time." Months turned into years, and Ethan's presence became a constant in Luke's life. The boy, now a teenager, grew into his own, a blend of Claire's strength and Ethan's determination. Ethan attended every milestone, every game, every science fair, making up for lost time with unwavering dedication. Claire and Ethan's relationship evolved as well. While they never quite returned to what they had once been, they found a partnership in co-parenting, built on mutual respect and a shared love for their son. One evening, as they sat together at one of Luke's soccer games, Claire turned to Ethan. "You've kept your promise," she said simply. Ethan smiled, his gaze on Luke. "I told you. I'm here for the long haul." Claire nodded, her expression softening. "You've given him something I never could, Ethan. A father." Ethan swallowed against the lump in his throat. "And you've given him everything he's ever needed. I'm just trying to catch up." As the game ended and Luke ran toward them, his face flushed with excitement, Ethan felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life hadn't turned out the way he had planned, but for the first time, he realized it had turned out exactly as it should. And as they walked off the field together, Luke in the middle, flanked by his parents, Ethan knew he was finally home.